Hello and welcome to SwitzerTV Property. I'm Peter Switzer. This program goes out on Thursday nights on our YouTube channel. Just go to Switzer Financial Group YouTube and you'll find it. Become a subscriber and press the like button as well. On tonight's show, Eliza Owen, Head of Research at CoreLogic, puts the house price growth around Australia into statistical perspective. Yep, it's happening. Bruce Hockman is an economist with the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and he'll look at the housing loan situation, and he also confirms, yep, the data is saying the market and the housing sector is on the way up again. And then Mike Day from an urban development company called Roberts Day says governments have to step up and spend because population growth has really shocked everyone, and therefore they have to spend on things like a very fast train to make sure that people can populate Australia, not always in the big cities, but around plenty of places where there's potential for growth. That's the show for tonight. So without any further ado, let's go and catch up with Eliza Owen from CoreLogic. We're trying to get to the bottom of what's really going on with house prices in Australia, and the right person to talk to is Eliza Owen, who's Head of Research in Australia for CoreLogic. Eliza, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So you know house prices are very controversial nowadays, and you guys are right in the middle of that controversy.
Okay.
True. That's a statement, I guess. So let's start off with the fact that house prices fell and a lot of doomsday merchants thought they'd fall 40%. What was the actual fall?
Overall, we saw a decline of about 8.6% nationally, but it varies depending on which market you're looking at. And you can't really talk about the Australian property market as one market. No. So very different performance across the capital cities. At June 2019, we saw that Sydney and Melbourne markets were very close to bottoming out. Each market bottomed out about 10% below their peak price. They've since had a really strong rebound. But then if you look at markets like Perth and Darwin, Perth is still sitting about 20% below its peak value, and the Darwin market is over 30% below its peak value, which they reached in about 2014 at the height of the mining boom.
Have those two markets always been more volatile than, say, Sydney and Melbourne?
I don't think they have always been more volatile. I think what happened was we actually saw like quite a convergence between housing cycles before the global financial crisis and before this kind of unprecedented mining boom. So it was after those kind of structural events that we started to see more volatility in the markets at different times. So now that we've seen the decline of mining investment, the Perth and Darwin markets have been falling in value for the better part of about 5 years.
And this might be a hard question, but you're the sort of person who should try and answer this.
I'll have a go.
If you looked at Perth and Darwin, where they were before the mining boom really fed their housing boom, are they still above where they started from?
I'd say they're coming back to those levels. I'd probably have to go and
it's a tough question. I
check
didn't prepare you for it, but I thought it's interesting to know. I can remember reporting that the Perth price rises in particular, and Darwin, were extraordinary for a long time when Sydney and Melbourne weren't doing much at all.
Yeah, exactly.
And that was purely because there was an exceptional mining boom. Would that be the fair argument?
Yeah, that's right. And then on the East Coast, you had the onset of the global financial crisis in Australia, which actually really hit Australia in 2009. And that was a time where the finance sector was more affected, say. And so markets like Sydney and Melbourne, where you have more job concentration in those sectors, weren't performing as well.
Okay. As I've got you here, I might as well keep asking you hard questions. You can always say, I don't know the answer to it, because I don't know the answer to it. I'm an economist as well. But you specialise in the area. Some of the critics of me, when I say I don't think we're going to fall 40% unless we have a really serious recession and unemployment goes over 10%, where I expect to see a really serious house price fall. But countries like Ireland have had and Spain had substantial falls in house prices. Is it sensible to compare our property market to, say, for example, the Irish market?
I think that the Australian financial markets have seen a lot more stability because we've had this oversight from APRA that's been coming in and implementing certain regulations that have enabled the lending space to become more, or I guess less susceptible to risky lending. So at the height of the previous upswings in Sydney and Melbourne, for example, we saw that nearly 50% of lending was going out on interest-only terms. So APRA comes in March 2017 and announces by September that year there's going to be a 30% cap on the portion of interest-only lending that goes out. And once that announcement was made, we saw the portion of interest-only lending drop significantly. It's now sitting at about half that, at about 14%. We see in the LVR space that a majority of loans are going out with an LVR of less than 80%. And we've also got stability in the nature of mortgage repayments as well. A majority of Australians who hold a mortgage are ahead on their repayments. Which is not to say that no one is struggling with mortgage repayments. But generally, I think we have a pretty sound lending space. And if that changes, as we've seen in the past, we know that APRA are likely to intervene again.
So it's a tick for regulators, from your point of view?
I think it's just created a more stable lending space. We see it in the data. And we also see in the finance data that a lot of the upswing that's happening at the moment is coming from people who are actually going to live in their properties. So we can expect that the quality of property transacting is better as well as a reflection of that. Obviously, in the wake of the Royal Commission, we've seen that there is a lot of regulation and review of what's needed when it comes to the sort of individual lending transactions. But on the aggregate, the numbers look pretty good.
So you're kind of implying that as the proportion of people who buy a home to live in increase relative to property investors, it makes our market, I guess, potentially less sensitive to big price falls, because an investor will vacate quickly, where a person doesn't easily walk away from their home unless they lose their job and they just can't make their payments.
I think there's really something in that, and we see that in like holding periods when we compare owner-occupiers to investors. Investors are more willing to cop a loss on their property, whereas owner-occupiers are more willing to hold because they're using the property as a consumption good.
Yeah, good point. Clearance rates now. Last weekend was pretty big.
Yeah, so last weekend we saw that the volume of auctions across the combined capital cities had broken 1,000. So we had about 1,100 auctions go up across the capital city markets. The preliminary clearance rate that we saw for the combined capitals was up near 70%. We've got our final numbers coming out tomorrow, so that might come down a little bit. But a pretty strong start when you consider that around this time last year, the clearance rate was sitting at sort of 50%, high 40s, so significant increase there.
Okay, and how about the supply of properties? Because that was part of the reason why house prices fell, because there weren't really a lot of properties on the market, but people turned up to auctions and kept bidding them up to extraordinary levels. And then the recovery of the market has been held back by the fact there aren't a real lot of, the prices have spiked because there aren't many properties on the market. Are we seeing an increase in the supply of properties going to auction in this autumn season?
It's interesting. We actually have seen an increase in the volume of properties going to auction. I think it's important to make a distinction when we talk about the supply of properties and prices. It's true that when there are more listings on the market generally, that this can put downward pressure on growth rates. It can give buyers more choice. But what we've seen in the auction space is that clearance rates can rise even though auction volumes are rising as well. In fact, auction volume rise, they rise because the potential sellers see the clearance rates going up, so that those two tend to sort of move together. So we've seen an uplift in volumes on this time last year, as well as those kind of stronger.
So what you're saying then is, and I think I heard that Sydney was around 80 and Melbourne was around 70%.
For the preliminary
So people
results,
in Sydney who hear that the clearance rates were 80% are more likely to turn up for an auction next weekend on the basis that this market's getting hot again, I better get in now. Is that the kind of thing you're thinking about?
Yeah, there is positive momentum in that because people see that prices are coming off their off the sort of recent lows, but it's also that sellers who were maybe sitting on the fence when it comes to selling their property, they're seeing those clearance rates and saying, okay, maybe now's a good time to sell because the clearance rate is high. We have a high incidence of potentially selling at auction.
Yeah. How long do you think this current boom's got before someone says, we can't do this anymore. We can't do this anymore.
It's a really good question.
Yeah, I want a good answer too.
So we're already seeing deceleration in growth rates.
Growth rates of prices or growth rates of auctions or?
Oh, of dwelling values, sorry.
Okay.
So of the value of the market.
Yep.
So if we look at what's happened in Sydney and Melbourne, say, over the past few months, in November last year, the monthly growth rate for Sydney was nearly 3%. As of January, that's now down to 1%.
This
Similar
is price growth.
Yes, yep. Similar in Melbourne. So we saw a result of about 2.2% in November, and it's come down to 1% as well.
Okay.
So I think that goes a long way in telling us that the kind of price rises that we've seen in this really strong rebound, they can't necessarily be sustained because you've got affordability constraints, and we will see more properties coming to market as well, which will put downward pressure on growth rates.
Okay, I think I've heard someone tip 2020 will see house prices rise by 8 to 10%. Do you think that's a little bit on the high side?
For which market?
Well, let's go Sydney and Melbourne because they're the ones who had the biggest drop, and the predictions were you would see 40% falls in markets like that. What's your best guess? I know it's a guess, but given the fact you've worked in this industry for quite some time, what's your best guess?
I think it could get up to those kinds of growth rates on an annual basis at some point over 2020. And I think that would be driven by a further cash rate cut. Yeah. So if we see a further reduction in mortgage rates and the mortgages are kind of cheaper than ever to hold, it would be an incentive for more people to get into the market, which tends to drive prices up. So if we look at research from the RBA, for example, they estimate that a 1% cut in the cash rate can lead to an 8% increase in property prices, assuming that the cash rate stays low. And I think in Sydney and Melbourne, where you've still got a fairly virtuous cycle in terms of employment and population growth, and people really wanting to live there, we've also got this cohort of millennials, the largest generation in Australia, which are moving through that 24 to 35 age group, which is your typical sort of first home buyer age group.
That's when they get sensible and or get old, get mature, and then go into the silliness of buying a home.
They make the transition from renting to owning something.
Yeah.
So I think with that added demographic pressure, that's another sort of demand factor that could add to the those sorts of price rises over 2020 in Sydney and Melbourne. Okay,
just for people around the country, my best guess, what do you think is going to happen in Brisbane?
So Brisbane, over the past few months, has seen some pretty good results, 2% over the 3 months to January. We saw the Brisbane dwelling market rise in values. And I think that growth rates could continue, perhaps even accelerate in Brisbane when you factor in a potential cash rate cut over 2020 and also more interstate migration. We're seeing that people are sort of looking to move away when you hit affordability constraints that are too high in Sydney and Melbourne. So that's something that could be a growth driver for Brisbane and broader southeast Queensland. We've also seen across the state that there's been a significant increase in the jobs in professional, scientific and technical services, which tend to be higher paid sort of jobs as well, which could translate to further demand in the Brisbane market. So I think that could be a good growth story for 2020.
Hobart?
Hobart, I think potentially a further deceleration in growth rates, just
done
because
very well, hasn't it?
It's had a really strong sort of boom period from about 2014. It's worth noting that that's off the back of a very stagnant growth period for Hobart. But I think, again, with affordability constraints locally, that could put downward pressure on growth rates. The thing that Hobart still has going for it is a very strong rental market, so that could attract more investor interest over the year.
Adelaide?
Adelaide, a pretty slow and steady performer.
Sneaking up as it usually does. Yeah.
It's a market that hasn't traditionally had a high proportion of investment, particularly in the house segment. So I think they could see a continuation of those sort of steady growth rates over 2020 off the back of, again, increased owner-occupier demand through those demographic trends and lower mortgage rates.
And a great place for investors, ACT.
Yeah, so that's been a pretty high growth market. We've seen fairly strong performance where the ACT market is now sitting the third most expensive property market behind Sydney and Melbourne. Yeah. And I think we could expect to continue seeing growth rates across the ACT rise. Again, it's that kind of relative affordability story. The only thing is they have recently seen a record high level of unit completion. So I think that segment of the market could grow more slowly than houses.
Great stuff. Eliza, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
That's Eliza Owen from CoreLogic. Bruce Hockman, thanks for joining us on SwitzerTV Property.
You're welcome.
So, Bruce, can we just work our way through, because there's a lot of controversy around the data, and I'm not going to ask you to do any forecasting, that's for speculators, but I'd love to get a feel for, as an economist, what you're seeing in the housing sector right now. And you have looked at housing finance data. What are you seeing?
Right. Well, housing finance data, as we released just a little while ago, was, I suppose, fitted with what we're seeing with building approvals as well. There's some indication that there's a bit of a turning point. There's been an uptick now in housing finance data for 4 consecutive months of lending to households for housing, so that's obviously being seen as a positive, and that aligns pretty well with the building approvals data, which has also been rising each month for the 4 months to December.
Yeah, okay, so were these numbers in stark contrast to what we saw from the middle of 2017 across 2018?
Look, I think so. In that it's fairly clear in the data that that earlier period is showing almost an uninterrupted decline, whereas now we're actually seeing those. I suppose if you're a forecaster, you'd be looking at this and thinking about green shoots of recovery and those sorts of things. But certainly, the weight of sort of consecutive rises certainly does support that interpretation.
Okay. You also look at home loan commitments. What are you seeing there?
Again, we're seeing that we're seeing the rise over, I think, again, the past 4 months of data coming through from the banks. Timing is interesting because it also coincides with a new collection vehicle that the Reserve Bank, APRA, and ourselves are using, but consistent across that time period, we're certainly seeing again an uptick in loan commitments. Yep. And you'd expect that to come through as drawdowns as well.
Yeah. Bruce, do you disaggregate the data so you can see what's happening to, say, for example, first home buyers and property investors?
We certainly look at first home buyers and property investors. It's probably a little bit messy right at the moment because we're right on the cusp of the introduction of the first home buyers scheme from the federal government, and we know that when state governments have introduced schemes, that's produced some uptick in the numbers, and it's even possible that with the scheme kicking in from January, that we actually were starting to see some of those commitments come through as people lined up their finance ahead of time.
So in terms of, say, let's concentrate first of all on first home buyers. Are we seeing them? I recall seeing there's a bit of an uptick during the period where the market was going down. So I guess I'm asking the question: as the market gets stronger and prices start to rise again, are first home buyers starting to drop out of the market?
We're not seeing that as yet. That remains a possibility. The other possibility, of course, is that they may choose to try and jump in early so that they don't miss the next upcycle. So once the upcycle's underway, there's something of a pressure to actually jump into the market. Now, admittedly, the market is a little bit segregated between the first home buyers and those that are buying subsequently. And we saw in previous episodes that as schemes came in that made it cheaper for first home buyers to enter the market, a lot of that ended up being absorbed in the price anyway.
Now, one of the things that we economists do, Bruce, and I think a lot of normal people don't get this, is that we try to look at the major variables that will determine, where consumption goes to, where house prices go to. And I know when I used to teach the consumption function at University of New South Wales, I explained to students there are things called marginal response coefficients, indicating which variables are more important and those which aren't important. When you try to look at the important drivers of house prices and therefore confidence in the housing sector, is it interest rates or is it jobs that is the more important factor driving enthusiasm for houses?
Look, it's it's like most things, it's a little of both. There's certainly, when you're looking for at the other end of the cycle or whatever, the drivers for a downturn in housing, jobs seem to be, and the outlook for jobs seem to be pretty important to that, which is, I suppose, one reason why people have remained pretty confident about the housing market has been that these sorts of levels of unemployment at around 5.1%, we're not likely to see the forced selling that creates the downturn in housing. So the fact that there's no downturn on the horizon, that seems to be something that housing is a long-term commitment, and the security of employment drives into that. At these levels of interest rates, it seemed like if you're trying to drive housing activity from interest rates, we've got to the point where it's probably like pushing on a piece of string.
Okay, so looking at the history that you've been involved in, looking at the housing sector, and I'm sure you were interested when you heard the stories that I was reacting to in the media, people predicting that house prices here could fall by 40%. I don't want you to make forward predictions, but looking at the history of the Australian property market, did you think it would have to be a very extreme set of economic circumstances that would see house prices fall by 40% in this country?
Look, it would be absolutely extreme for anything like that to happen. As I talked about, the employment data, the possibility of forced selling, a lot of those really extreme predictions come from offshore economists, and they really don't understand, I think, the dynamics of the Australian property market, the fact that we don't have non-recourse loans, the fact that we have this cultural connection to housing seems to be something that they don't factor in. It's unlikely the Reserve Bank would ever push interest rates to the level again, or not in any foreseeable future, where they themselves create some of that carnage. So all of those things mitigate against those disaster type scenarios. In fact, I think the most extreme one that I've seen had a 90% fall in property prices in particular areas, and that means $1 million house selling for $100,000. That's just no scenario I can conceive that creates that.
Bruce Hockman from the ABS, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome.
Well, a lot of people will be surprised to learn that we've hit 30 million people in Australia about 30 years ahead of what was expected. To work out the implications for areas like real estate, I've got Mike Day, who is the co-founder of Roberts Day, which is an urban planning and design firm, and he's a fellow with the Planning Institute as well. Mike, thanks for joining us.
Oh, good morning, Peter. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, let's kick off first of all. Just tell us what your firm does.
So, Peter, we've basically got studios around the country. We started off in Perth, but we've now got studios in all the capital cities, and we provide a consultancy service to the land development industry and the urban development industry. And our mainstay is laying the foundation for new communities. So basically build new towns, new townships, and we do a lot of work around transit stations, transit-oriented development, that sort of thing.
Okay. So tell us about the population growth surprise.
Okay, so Peter, what's happened is back in 1988, the ABS projected that we would hit 30 million in 2050. So what's happened is we've actually got to a population of 25 million 20 or 25 years ahead of those projections. So we've really, and last year I think there was an increase of 400,000, the population increase of 400,000. So what it's causing is a lot of problems in terms of congestion and overbuilding in our capital cities that we're really struggling to sort of keep up with. So what the proposition is that we really should be building new cities. So the demographers and the ABS are now projecting that we need to build essentially a new Canberra every year for the next 40 years to really sort of accommodate that growth. And what we've been doing is just incrementally building around the outskirts of the capital cities, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, in a very suburban manner, which is causing lots of problems. Okay,
so can I guess link it to a story that's been around for a long time, and that is if we have a very fast train, places like Goulburn outside of Sydney could become a new urban centre. Do we need that kind of infrastructure change to build a new Canberra? Every year, did you say?
Every year for the next 40 years. So we've got 16.8 million people that we need to accommodate over that 40-year period. So that equates to 400,000. That equates to a Canberra every year, or a Darwin every 12 weeks. And the problem we've got at the moment is we're incrementally developing in a very suburban pattern. It's very much car dependent, and it's causing congestion problems. So one of the biggest issues we've got now is congestion around particularly the two mega cities of Melbourne and Sydney. So we're projected to go from 5 million to 9 and 10 million. And you're aware that Melbourne's due to exceed Sydney in terms of size, primarily because of topography. So we've got these two mega cities, almost doubling in size, and very little in between. And it's interesting that Boris Johnson this morning or yesterday has just announced the high-speed rail HS2, the high-speed rail from London to Birmingham, which is going to, and the proposition is that you rebalance the settlements. So rather than just putting all the development within those two cities, we'll be able to sort of revitalise and rejuvenate, I think, sort of a lot of the country towns and the country areas that are between Sydney and Melbourne.
Well, what about that Goulburn strategy that people keep mentioning all the way along the line?
Well, that's part and parcel of it. So what's proposed is the possibility of 8 new cities between Melbourne and Sydney, one of which would be between Canberra and Sydney, and that link would be vitally important as well. And because the air routes at the moment, we're told, are between, I think, number 2 or number 3 in the world in terms of most heavily trafficked air routes in the world between Sydney and Melbourne. Connection between Canberra and Sydney would be vital in the overall, and that Goulburn would be ideally positioned to take advantage of that.
Is there a government reluctance to make a big commitment to the kind of infrastructure investment that's required for a very fast train, and then to put the dollar muscles behind developing a Goulburn or making Wollongong or Newcastle equivalent to, say, Sydney or Melbourne?
Yeah, well, there's no question that it's a significant impost to build a high-speed rail, or put the infrastructure in. But then there's been a lot of discussion more recently about value capture or value creation. So the essence of what's being proposed in the latest business case that the federal government are considering, they've set up a high-speed rail authority and they've appointed a CEO, and they're considering a business case that proposes to build the high-speed rail and to build new cities around these rail hubs that are on rural land, and then obviously there's an uplift in the value of that land, which will then defray the cost of putting the high-speed rail in. So it's a quid pro quo there, and I think that's the most advantageous way to put forward these high-speed rail propositions.
Yeah, because you will then get developers wanting to build, suburbs and towns around the major centres. So it becomes like a win-win multiplier, doesn't it?
It does, Peter, but the essence of it is so important that, as you say, rather than the suburban model, it has to be something urban. We've been talking more recently about urbanising the burbs. We need an urban form. Think of townhouses or courtyard housing, maybe even apartments that are in close proximity to the rail stations. That alleviates the need for particularly the younger generations to purchase cars. And we're seeing this now. A lot of the younger kids, they aren't getting their licence till they're 28 or 30 years old. Some of them aren't getting licences at all, but they need to live in an environment that fosters that urban sort of setting. Everything's compact, connected, mixed use and walkable.
Yeah, I guess it's fair to say once you've got those little ankle biters running around in your life, that's when you might think, I at least need to hire a car or something like that, because certainly children change your lifestyle, don't they? And on that subject, that's what you're referring to, isn't it? That we need lifestyle changes, or we need to accommodate the lifestyle changes that we're seeing develop right now.
Well, I think that you've actually nailed it there. This is the real issue. It's not so much just affordable housing, it's affordable living, because the transport costs now, and when you look at Sydney as the second most expensive city in the world to purchase a house, and Melbourne I think is about fourth or fifth most expensive in the world, that it's not just affordable housing. The cost of transport now, particularly for those that are out in these suburbs, is actually exceeding the cost of housing. So what the RACV and RACQ are saying is it's $10,000 to $12,000 per car that the annual cost of running a car every year is $10,000 to $12,000, and that could save $100,000 off the mortgage. So if we can create these walkable neighbourhoods connected with transit, got the electric bikes, we've got all these other modes of Uber and car share, then they'll alleviate the need for the car. It'll become much more affordable.
Mike, thanks for joining us on the show.
Pleasure, Peter. Thank you very much. All the best.